You'd have to be. Now, I understand that people say he's not is comparing him to other NBA players because obviously all of these players are the elite of athletes in the world. In fact, you could argue that NBA players are the best athletes out of any professional sports group in the world. They have both the strength and the physical endurance to football, for example. And so Nikola Jokic plays at a high level day in, day out, in Denver, high elevation. If you've ever visited your power, so he's doing day in, MVP numbers that he does. So I'm sorry, he's way more athletic than people. Way more. And really, I think the only reason anyone says that just has to do with how he looks. That's more muscular, I don't think anyone would be making this case. The truth is that the way that someone looks doesn't always correlate to their level of athleticism. People can sit here and argue about Nikola Jokic's athletic ability while he continues to win championships and put up historic numbers. I think Jokic is way more athletic than people give him credit for. This is NBA Informatics, the fusion of technology and NBA basketball.
Cause I just wanna hear it out your mouth, yeah. Give me fuel, it's a tool that I use to go to hell, yeah. I take shots, I take loss, I make shots, I miss lots. I say you get big box, you get got, swing lots and pop off a big shot. I'm done getting when you got big things in patience. Who's at the top thinking you for the place? Who's at the top thinking you're gonna
totals, ending with the conclusion of who's the greater basketball player ever. Today, our matchup is a round bound of rebounder Charles Barkley versus the mailman Karl Malone. One legend built his legacy as a member of the 76ers, Suns, and Rockets, while the other spent almost the entirety of his career with the Utah Jazz before closing it out with the Lakers. Starting with the basics, Barkley was listed as a 6'6" power forward, although he was probably more accurately around 6'4", and typically weighed around 250 pounds. Malone was a 6'9" power forward who weighed around 250 pounds. We'll compare these two grades with 5 major categories, with sometimes varying categories depending on positions and playstyle. In this video, for these two power forwards, the categories are scoring, efficiency, rebounding, defense, and accolades. First off, scoring. Both of these legends were almost always their team's leading scorer, as Malone had a career scoring average of 25 points. He didn't win any scoring titles, but he is currently ranked second among the NBA's all-time scoring leaders, and his career high was 61 points against the Bucks in 1990. Malone also averaged 24.7 points in his playoff career, which puts him in 20th place on the all-time list. Barkley had a career scoring average of 22.1 points, and he didn't win any scoring titles either. He's currently ranked in 26th place on the NBA's all-time scoring list, and his career high was 56 points against the Warriors in 1994. His career playoff scoring average was 22 points, which currently ranks him 33rd all-time. Malone was one of the more dominant and consistent scorers of basketball history, quite frequently the beneficiary of a John Stockton assist, whether in the fast break or from the pick and roll. He was one of the more incredibly strong players of the game who fiercely attacked the rim and had the power to assert his will. He also had a very smooth and reliable mid-range jumper. People often don't recognize how great of a scorer the mailman actually was. His era wasn't really the most statistically productive time in history. In the entirety of the 1990s decade, only one player other than Michael Jordan averaged over 30 points per game in a season, and that was Karl Malone in the 89-90 season. Here's another way of putting his elite scoring in context. Karl Malone has no scoring titles in the entirety of his playing career, but that isn't necessarily his fault, as it's actually just a byproduct of playing in the same era as Michael Jordan. As I said, Malone has no scoring titles, but if Michael Jordan did not exist, Malone would have 5 of them. which would then give him the second most in NBA history, behind only Wilt Chamberlain. He also would have a couple more championships and another MVP, but I digress. Barkley could score well in his own right, as he was an absolute force in transition, especially in his days with Philadelphia. Barkley would also bully opponents in the post, and was famous for slowly backing down his defender until he was in an ideal position to score. He was so dominant and efficient at this that the NBA created the 5-second back-to-the-basket rule to try to discourage players like Barkley from abusing it to such an extent. As good as Barkley was, he was almost never quite as explosive of a scorer as Malone was. I'm sure the luxury of having John Stockton as his point guard for basically his entire career definitely helped. But still, whether that's true or not, the gap is too big to make up for it. Second up is rebounding. This is an area where both power forwards were very solid, as they both are currently within the top 20 of the all-time list. Although Malone is significantly higher on the list, that's mostly due to his longevity, which, to his credit, required maintained conditioning and athleticism. With that being said, Barkley gained his round mound of rebounding nickname for a reason. As he has a higher career rebounding average than Malone, he has a rebounding title, which Malone does not, and in every season of his career other than his rookie season where he played less than 30 minutes a game, he averaged over 10 rebounds. Even in his much longer remembered years with the Celtics, Barkley was still a beast on the boards, easily out-rebounding Hakeem Olajuwon in all of his 4 seasons there. I could break this down from many different angles, but at the end of the day, it's an easy decision. Rebounding goes to Charles Barkley. Third up is efficiency, and at first, I was going to include turnovers in this area, but long story short, it's basically a tie. You may not have known this, but Karl Malone has the most turnovers in NBA history, at least until LeBron surpasses him this upcoming season. Not necessarily a claim that Malone should be proud of. Especially for a power forward, he did have a bit of an issue protecting the basketball. But with that being said, a major contributing factor to his turnover total is his longevity. If everyone had a career as long as Malone's, then there would be a ton of players ahead of him. Barkley had some of these issues as well, as both players averaged the same amount of turnovers over the course of their career. So how about efficiency in terms of shooting the basketball? Well, Malone was certainly reliable, especially considering the amount of shots he took per game. For his career, he shot a solid 51.6% from the field and a decent 74.2% from the three-point line. He shot only 27.4% from three-point range, but that stat is basically irrelevant, as Malone never shot that many three-pointers, as it wasn't a regular part of his game. And as solid as Malone was at effectively scoring the basketball, Barkley was actually great at it. For his career, he shot 54.1% from the field, which is incredible for a season, let alone a career. To put in context how amazing that is, listen to this stat. Out of the top 50 scorers on the all-time list, he's the most efficient non-center from the field in NBA history at 54.1%. If you include centers, he was third, behind Kareem, who had the most indefensible shot in NBA history, and behind Shaq, who basically spent his entire career mostly dunking the basketball. Now the crazy thing about Barkley is that as historically great as he was from an efficiency standpoint, he could have been even better. Barkley's Achilles heel was his abusive obsession with shooting three-pointers. There is no worse three-point shooter than Charles Barkley. I'm not even being sarcastic when I say that. Objectively speaking, of all players who shot at least 1,000 three-pointers in their career, Barkley is literally the most inefficient shooter in NBA history. For some reason, despite being so terrible from distance, he simply couldn't stop shooting them, even reaching as high as 25th place in the league in three-point attempts in 1993. It was like he was salivating every time he got around the three-point line and just couldn't help himself. Some will say that shooting the outside shot helps keep defenses honest, but when you're literally the worst shooter ever, let's be real, you're not keeping any defenses honest, because they can simply give you the Ben Simmons treatment and beg you to shoot. Here's a funny stat that again emphasizes this issue. In 5 straight seasons from 1987 to 1991, Barkley led the entire league in efficiency from range, but in none of those seasons did he lead the league in overall field goal percentage, because he shot so many three-pointers. With all that being said, efficiency easily goes in favor of Barkley, even though he could have chilled a bit on three-point shots. Next up is defense, and neither of these forwards were scrubs in that area. Both averaged just about the same amount of steals and blocks over the course of the career. But with Barkley's roughly 6'4" frame, was a bit undersized in the paint, and wasn't always able to contest the offensive player's shots. Malone, on the other hand, was a strong 6'9" monster defensively in the interior, and was very good at staying in front of his man and giving very few easy looks. Although I definitely wouldn't describe Barkley as a bad defender, he never made any all-defense teams throughout his career. Malone, on the other hand, made 4 all-defense teams, and 3 of those were first team. Simply and concisely, Malone takes the defensive category. Last on the list of categories is accolades, and both of these greats had plenty of them. Malone for his career was the 1997 and 1999 league MVP. He made 14 All-Star teams, 14 All-NBA teams, 4 All-Defense teams, and made 2 trips to the NBA Finals. In his 19 seasons, he averaged 25 points, 10.1 rebounds, 3.6 assists, and 1.4 steals on 51.6% shooting. Barkley was the 1993 league MVP. He made 11 All-Star teams, 11 All-NBA teams, he was the 1987 rebounding champion, and he made 1 trip to the NBA Finals. In his 16 seasons, he averaged 22.1 points, 11.7 rebounds, 3.9 assists, and 1.5 steals on 54.1% shooting. Ultimately, this is a very tough decision, and I think that's why so many people requested this video. It might seem controversial to most of you, but for myself personally, Charles Barkley gets the edge as the greater player. When both guys were at their best, I think Barkley was slightly the player. He was also incredibly unique, as he was one of the most efficient scorers in NBA history, despite the fact that he was undersized power forward. He was said this way, and I definitely agree with the statement. Malone had the better career, Barkley was the better player. I also can't completely ignore the aspect of John Stockton. Malone had the luxury of having one of the greatest facilitators of all time as his point guard for almost the entirety of his career. Barkley didn't have that same luxury for his entire career, and that's saying something when he already has a resume that's putting him on the same level as Karl Malone. I can only imagine the kind of career numbers he would have put up if someone like Stockton was his point guard for basically his whole career. Now let me make this clear. There's a reason why these greats are compared so much throughout their careers, and why the comparisons extend even years after they've both retired. Because it's very close, and I certainly won't fault you if you disagree with my conclusion, but I would like to know why. Let me know in the comments section who you think was the greater player, or the mailman. Today, our matchup is the Diesel, Shaquille O'Neal, versus the Dream, Hakeem Olajuwon. One legend built his legacy as a member of 6 different franchises, while the other spent almost the entirety of his career with the Houston Rockets before closing it out with the Raptors. Starting with the basics, Shaq was listed as a 7'1" center who typically weighed around 325 pounds. Hakeem was a 7'4" center who weighed around 255 pounds. With a grading straight rate for 5 different categories, which sometimes vary in categories depending on position and play styles, I'm in his video for these 2 all-time great big men. The categories are scoring, efficiency, rebounding, defense, and first off, both of these legends are on the list of the greatest scorers in NBA history, as Shaq is in 8th place with over 28,000 points. The Diesel also has 2 scoring titles in his career and has a career average of 23.7 points. His career high was 61 points against the Clippers in 2000, and he averaged 24.3 points for his career in the playoffs, which ranks him 24th on the all-time list. Now Hakeem is in 11th place on the NBA's all-time scoring list with nearly 27,000 points. He had no scoring titles and had a career average of 21.6 points. His career average was 50 points against the Nuggets in 1990, and he averaged 25.9 points over his career in the playoffs, which ranks him in 11th place on the all-time list. For Shaq, you really can't put it perfectly into words just how dominant he was offensively in his prime, but you had to live through that era to completely understand it. Some of the titles in the league he simply tossed aside like they were rabbits. These players knew exactly what the game plan was. How the offense would be run through Shaq, and they still couldn't stop him. Shaq was so good offensively that he often made the spot-up shooters on his team significantly better. When the defense would have to send a second or even third defender to collapse on Shaq, often the open teammates were guys like Nick Anderson, Brian Shaw, Rick Fox, and Robert Horry. Many of these role players made names for themselves by being the beneficiaries of Shaq demanding so much attention. While Shaq essentially played bully ball, Hakeem was likely the most offensively skilled big man to ever lace him up. He had an all-time great mid-range game, fadeaway, and jump hook. I won't even say arguably for this next one, it's simply a fact. Hakeem has the greatest footwork of any center who's ever played the game. He was the finesse to Shaq's power, the grace to O'Neal's authority. Although you could certainly make the case that Hakeem scored in more variety of ways, you also have to acknowledge that 2 points is 2 points, regardless of how you get them. Hakeem may have been more talented offensively, but whatever Shaq was lacking in skills and talent, he easily made up for it with power and brute force. Shaq has more scoring titles, is higher on the all-time scoring list, and has a higher career average. Scoring goes to Shaquille O'Neal. Second up is rebounding. Neither of these centers would you describe as go-to rebounding, but both of them did their jobs and did it consistently for a long period of time. For his career, Shaq averaged 10.9 rebounds, getting as high as 13. He never once led the league in rebounding, which is a bit surprising considering his size, strength, and how long he played. Regardless, his consistency was good enough to get on the all-time list. Now, Hakeem was significantly lighter than Shaq and wasn't able to maintain his will with Shaq. Hakeem was very good at reading the floor, boxing out, and anticipating the direction of the rebound. Over his career, he averaged 11.1 rebounds, which is just slightly ahead of Shaq. He also has 2 rebounding titles, getting as high as 14 rebounds per game in 1990. He's also 2 spots ahead of Shaq on the all-time rebound list. No matter which statistic or measure you look at in this category, it's extremely close, but in almost every instance, Hakeem has a small edge, which makes rebounding goes ever so slightly in the favor of a lifetime. Third up is efficiency. Getting in an ideal position to score was Shaq's specialty. He couldn't consistently hit anything outside of 10 feet, but he really didn't need to, considering his ability to assert his will in the low post. With Shaq's baby hooks, his dunks, and all the other ways he scored in the interior, he shot a remarkable 58.2% from the field for his career, and led the league in field goal percentage a whopping 10 times. His career 58.2% is the 7th highest field goal percentage in NBA history, and it's significantly higher than Hakeem Olajuwon's 51.2%. With that being said, being an efficient player is a lot more than simply field goal percentage. One of the major aspects is free throw shooting. When the opposing team makes you earn the 2 points, can you punish them from 15 feet out? To say this was a struggle for Shaq would be a massive understatement. He was one of the worst free throw shooters of all time, who shot a terrible 52.7% for his career. He was the worst free throw shooter in the entire league and 8 times throughout his career. Needless to say, the mid-range artist that was Hakeem Olajuwon shot a significantly more efficient 71.2% from the free throw line. And now, when you factor in both field goal percentage and free throw percentage, their true shooting percentage is much more comparable. Technically, from a pure numbers standpoint, Shaq still has the edge in true efficiency, but he was so terrible from the free throw line that there was plenty of instances during the fundamentals of games where Shaq had to go to the bench on offense. That way, the defense couldn't intentionally foul him, forcing him to make free throws. So what small edge Shaq has over Hakeem in true shooting percentage, he loses in my mind due to this fact. I have to call efficiency a tie between the two centers. Next up is defense, and every category has been pretty close up to this point, but this one is not. Throughout Shaq's career, he was a pretty good defensive anchor and rim protector for his team. He averaged 2.3 blocks in his career, but he also had 3 shots. He also had just 3 all-time honors. Hakeem Olajuwon has nearly as many defensive player of the year awards as Shaq has all defense team appearances. Hakeem had 9 all-defense team appearances throughout his career, what Shaq had. He was an absolute dog when contesting shots, as he averaged 3.1 blocks over his career and is easily the all-time leader in recorded block shots. Just how big is the gap exactly? Well, he's ahead of second place on the all-time list by 541 block shots. To put that in perspective, in each of the last 3 seasons of the NBA, the leading shot blocker has finished with around 195 blocks in the season. That means Hakeem Olajuwon is just about 3 league-leading seasons of blocks ahead of the nearest competitor. Along with that, only 10 players in league history have won the Defensive Player of the Year award multiple times. Of those 10 players, no one averaged more points in his career than Hakeem Olajuwon. Typically, the greatest rim protectors in NBA history are not also the greatest scorers of all time, but Hakeem Olajuwon and Wilt Chamberlain are the exceptions. It's also worth mentioning that Hakeem averaged 1.7 steals over his career, which is incredibly high for someone who plays the center position, and is nearly 3 times what Shaq averaged. So yeah, no surprises here, as defense easily goes to Hakeem. Last on the list of categories is accolades, and both of these legends had a ton of them. Shaq was a 4-time champion, a 3-time Finals MVP, and he was the 2000 League MVP. He made 15 All-Star teams, 14 All-NBA teams, and 3 All-Defense teams. He was also a 2-time scoring champion. In his 19 seasons, he averaged 23.7 points, 10.9 rebounds, 2.5 assists, 0.6 steals, and 2.3 blocks on 58.6 true shooting percentage. Hakeem was a 2-time champion, a 2-time Finals MVP, and the 1994 League MVP. He made 12 All-Star teams, 12 All-NBA teams. He was a 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, a 2-time Rebounder champion, and a 3-time Blocks champion. It's also worth mentioning that he achieved a quadruple-double in the 1990 season, and was only 1 assist shy of having a second one within the same month. In his 18 seasons, he averaged 21.8 points, 11.1 rebounds, 2.5 assists, 1.7 steals, and 3.1 blocks on 55.3% true shooting percentage. As usual, it's really close in these versus videos, and in this video in particularly, there's so much to be said that we haven't already covered in these categories. Like how both of these big men were underrated passers, and how they each were some of the greatest clutch performers in playoff history. But at the end of the day, when it's all said and done, I personally rank Hakeem Olajuwon slightly higher on the all-time list than Shaquille O'Neal. In my opinion, he's simply a complete player, and he's legitimately in the argument for the title of greatest two-way player in NBA history. Yes, Shaq has twice as many championships as Hakeem does, but I also think that a part of that is the level of people support that they each had during their primes. This is an actual stat, and feel free to fact check me on this, but Hakeem Olajuwon is the only player in NBA history to lead his team to back-to-back championships without a second All-Star on the roster. You could argue that Clyde Drexler was an All-Star caliber player in their second championship run, but he literally wasn't selected. And you and I both know that a young Kobe Bryant wasn't a borderline All-Star in Shaq's second championship run, but he was a legit superstar. So here's my hot take. If you give Hakeem Olajuwon the talent Shaq had supporting him through his best years, like Penny Hardaway and Horace Grant in Orlando, a young Kobe, and a multitude of shooters in LA, or Dwayne Wade as his absolute best in Miami, then Hakeem is getting at least as many championships as Shaq did, if not more. Today, of his career playing in the NBA in the late 90s and throughout the 2000s, while the other played in the ABA and NBA throughout the 70s and 80s. Starting with the basics, Iverson was a 6-foot point-guard shooting guard who weighed about 165 pounds. Gervin was a 6'7 shooting guard / small forward who weighed about 180 pounds. We'll compare these two greats with 5 major categories, which are scoring, playmaking, efficiency, defense, and scoring. It's no secret that both of these legends are among the greatest scorers in NBA history. Iverson had a career scoring average of 26.7 points. He was still scoring Iverson also has the in NBA history at 29.7 points, trailing only to Jordan. Gervin had a career scoring average of 25.1 points. He also won 4 scoring titles, and his career high was 63 points against the New Orleans Jazz in 1978, and his career playoff scoring average was 26.5. Iverson was a volume shooting assassin, and he spent the majority of his career carrying a 76ers offense with little offensive support. He had a smooth jump shot and was fearless when attacking the paint, accompanied with an all-time great layup package. Thanks to Iverson's brave and aggressive nature, he was always among the league leaders in free throw attempts, averaging significantly more attempts over his career than Gervin did. Iverson was also an elite scorer for a significant amount of time. He averaged at least 25 points per game in 10 straight seasons, which only him and 7 other players have ever accomplished. And unfortunately for Gervin, he wasn't all that close to being one of them. Now, the Iceman did the majority of his damage in the mid-range and intermediate area. He's famously known as the player who made the finger roll famous, and he was overall just incredibly talented at finishing around the rim. He was never much of a perimeter shooter, averaging less than 1 3-point attempt per game over the course of his career. Overall, when you look at consistent scoring and the variety of ways they could do it, the edge goes slightly to Allen Iverson. Second up is playmaking. This is another area where the answer stands out. As famous and well-known as he was as a scorer, he often doesn't get enough credit for his solid passing abilities and play vision. He managed to make solid passes and get a ton of assists considering the amount of shots he was taking per game. On Iverson's career, he shot 21.8 shots per game and averaged 6.2 assists per game. His 21.8 shots is the fourth highest shots per game average in NBA history. Of the top 10 players with the highest shots per game average of all time, only one player averaged more assists per game over their career than Allen Iverson, which was Jerry West. Among these players are legends like Michael Jordan, Pistol Pete Maravich, and Rick Barry, and Iverson averaged more assists per game than all of them. He did this with his vision, but he was also one of the greatest ball handlers of all time, and he's extremely quick, which often forced a second defender to help on Iverson, which naturally opened up his teammates for clean looks. Now, although Gervin's 6'7" frame was hard to defend, it's no secret that George often looked to make a play just for himself rather than his teammates as well. In the entirety of Gervin's career, he never once averaged at least 4 games a season, facilitating really wasn't his. In Iverson's 14 years in the NBA, he never once averaged as few assists as Gervin did in his best season. With all of these things considered, playmaking clearly goes to Allen Iverson. Third up is efficiency, and although this has been an area where Allen Iverson has been criticized by some analytic-loving basketball fans, it's certainly not as bad as advertised. His career field goal percentage is 42%, but his true shooting percentage is very comparable to other greats but on the other hand is Gervin, who wasn't just great as a scorer, but he was one of the greatest ever in that time period. An incredible fact about the Iceman is that other than LeBron James, he's the only wing player in NBA history to have a career average of over 25 points per game while shooting over 50% of his shooting. Again, just LeBron and George Gervin. His best single season overall came in the 1979 to 1980 season, where he averaged 33.1 points per game while shooting 50.8%. Other than LeBron, no player in NBA history has ever averaged that many points while shooting above 50% per season, let alone Dirk hitting 100%. Iverson was a decent 78% from the free throw line, but Gervin for his career shot an elite 84.1%. In this area of efficiency, the edge is strongly given to George Gervin. Next is defense, which is a bit of a complicated aspect for these two greats. In the case of Iverson, he was often undersized, guarding players significantly taller and heavier than him, but at one point, he actually led the NBA in steals per game for 3 consecutive seasons. With that being said, he never once made an all-defense team appearance, and in large part, that was because most people could recognize that he wasn't a great on-ball defender, which Iverson himself said, but he was good at jumping the pass lanes, which can be risky and sometimes resulted in a defensive breakdown for his team and a basket for the opponent. Gervin wasn't known to be an elite on-ball defender either, as he also never made an all-defense team appearance. But at the very least, he could be a decent help defender, and he was a bit of an underrated shot blocker, which in large part had to do with his long wingspan and his terrific leaping ability. He averaged 1.2 blocks over his career, reaching as high as 1.8 during the 73-74 season, which is significantly higher than most wing players. With all of those aspects considered, I have to call this one a tie between both stars. Last on the list of categories is accolades, and both of these greats had plenty of them. Iverson for his career was the 2001 League MVP. He was a 4-time scoring champion, 3-time steals champion. He made 11 All-Star teams, 7 All-NBA teams, and made 1 trip to the NBA Finals. In his 14 seasons, he averaged 26.7 points, 6.2 assists, 3.7 rebounds, and 2.2 steals on 42.5% shooting. Gervin was a 4-time scoring champion. He made 12 All-Star teams, 7 All-NBA teams, and 2 All-ABA teams, but he never made it to the ABA or NBA Finals. For his career, he averaged 25.1 points, 5.3 rebounds, 2.6 assists, and 1 block, 50.4% shooting. With all aspects considered, ultimately, it's close. Very close. but I have to say that Allen Iverson is just slightly ahead of Gervin as the greater overall player. And the major separating factor is how Iverson can impact the game in a number of ways with his skill set of playmaking and distributing, to go along with the fact that he's one of the greatest scorers, and especially playoff scorers, the game has ever seen. Today, our matchup is the big ticket, Kevin Garnett, versus the 7-foot sniper, Dirk Nowitzki. One legend built his legacy as a member of 3 different franchises, while the other spent the entirety of his career playing for the Mavericks. Starting with the basics, Garnett was listed as a 6'11" power forward who typically weighed around 240 pounds. Nowitzki was a 7-foot power forward who weighed around 245 pounds. We'll compare these two grades with 5 major categories, which sometimes vary in categories depending on positions and playstyles. In this video, for these 2 all-time great forwards, the categories are scoring, efficiency, rebounding, defense, and accuracy. Both of these greats made their mark as elite scorers in the league, as Garnett is in 18th place on the all-time scoring list with over 26,000 points. He has no scoring titles in his career and had a career average of 17.8 points. His career high was 47 points against the Suns in 2005, and he averaged 18.2 points for his career in the playoffs, which ranks him 112th on the all-time list. Now Dirk is in 6th place on the NBA's all-time scoring list with over 31,000 points. He also had no scoring titles and had a career average of 20.7 points. His career high was 53 points against the Rockets in 2004, and he averaged 25.3 points over his career in the playoffs, which ranks him in 15th place on the all-time list. Garnett was a very good ball handler for his 6'11" frame, and he was excellent at creating his own shot. He had a smooth mid-range jump shot that was extremely hard to defend, considering his high above the rim releases. Garnett always played with the flow of the offense for his team, and wasn't the type to force any bad shots, as he never averaged more than 20 shot attempts per game. With that being said, his best season scoring the basketball was the 03-04 season, the year which he won the league MVP, and he averaged 24.2 points in the season. During the majority of his prime, he was typically averaging just barely over 20 points per game. Now Dirk, on the other hand, had an even more difficult shot to defend, as the 7-footer consistently utilized his signature fadeaway, which is right up there with Kareem's skyhook as some of the most difficult shots to defend in NBA history. Dirk really slowed down quite a bit as he aged, but especially in his youth, he had a pretty quick first step and was capable of but obviously, what he was known for more than anything was his elite perimeter shooting, as he was consistently among the league leaders in three-pointers made. With all of these skills and abilities at his disposal, he was frequently among the elite scorers in the NBA. His highest seasonal average was 26.6 points in the 05-06 season, and he had 6 entire seasons where he averaged more points than Kevin Garnett's best season. I could delve into more aspects, but the truth is, this category isn't all that close, as Nowitzki comfortably takes the scoring comparison. Second up is rebounding, and this is another category that isn't all that close. To put it simply, Dirk was not he wasn't known to play the game of basketball very physically, and it certainly wasn't his style to bang on the boards and fight for loose balls. For his career, he averaged just 7.5 rebounds per game. In his 21 seasons, he never once averaged at least 10 rebounds per game, which is pretty stunning considering the amount of minutes he played and considering the fact that he was a 7-foot power forward. Now KG is the complete opposite of that, as he was an elite rebounder who was known for his physical nature around the painted area. For his 21-year career, he averaged 10 rebounds per game, getting as high as 13.9 in 2004. In 4 straight seasons from 2004 to 2007, he led the league in rebounds per game. That 4 straight seasons is the 3rd longest streak in NBA history, behind only the streaks of Dennis Rodman and Moses Malone. No need to judge the point in the as rebounding really does in Kevin Garnett. Third up is efficiency. Now Kevin Garnett was a strong finisher and trailer in the fast break, but he mixed in plenty of jump shots into his game, and even with that perimeter aspect, he shot nearly 50% after his career at a solid 49.7%. He was also relatively a pretty good free throw shooter for his size, as he shot 78.9% from the free throw line. Now Dirk shot the ball more often than Garnett did, and perimeter shooting was an even more significant part of his game than it was for KG, as Dirk shot 47.1% for his career, which is slightly lower than Garnett's career total. But as I've said in past videos, efficiency is a whole lot more than simply filtering percentage. Not only was Dirk among the best three-point shooters in the league, but he was also one of the best free throw shooters, hitting 87.9% of his attempts over his career. In 2006, Dirk had a 50-40-90 season, which less than 10 players have ever done in league history, and Dirk is the only official 7-footer to ever accomplish that feat. True shooting percentage factors in all kinds of shots on the basketball court, and when we look at that advanced stat, the edge is now Dirk's favor. Consider that Dirk shot the ball more and scored more than KG as well, then you begin to see how there's really no way to make a solid argument in favor of KG in this one. Efficiency goes to Dirk Nowitzki. Next up is defense, and this one has the biggest gap of all of the categories. I certainly wouldn't describe Dirk as a bad defender, especially in his early years, as he had the size and length to contest many shots, and he did have some quickness to keep up with the offensive player in front of him. But as he got older, that quickness declined dramatically, and once Dirk was into his 30s, it was very common to see reoccurring blow-bys, as he no longer had the lateral speed to challenge the offensive player, and many times he was the